Welcome back to the EGPP Seminar Series. I hope everyone had a good Easter break in spite of all the restrictions. The situation remains critical, unfortunately. For those who join us for the first time, my name is Daniele Caramani and I will be chairing the session today. Today we have a session of the EGPP Seminar Series, which is run by the EU Studies Working Group, and this is organized by the UI researchers. This is a way that we have to connect with the researchers, and I think it's a very important contribution to our seminar series. And today's presenter is a researcher from the SPS department, Rouven Symank, and he will present a paper on European solidarity in times of crisis. Thank you very much, Rouven, for accepting our invitation. We're very much looking forward to your presentation. Unfortunately, we must continue to hold the seminar fully online, given that Tuscany is still in the red zone and we are unable to meet in person. It will be nonetheless a very interesting session, and the previous sessions fully online have also proved that it's possible to have lively discussions via Zoom. Rouven will speak for about 30 to 40 minutes. We have plenty of time then for discussion, Q&A. We go straight through Q&A and with the possibility to ask questions and make comments. We don't have a discussant of the paper. To ask questions or to make comments, you can use the hand function. During the whole session, I would like to ask everyone to keep the video on if it's possible, but remember to mute your microphones to avoid the disturbances. Thank you very much to everyone for being with us today, especially to our speaker, Rouven. Please, the floor is yours. If you like to share your slides, you can do it now, and then you can start your presentation. Thank you. Excellent.
Thank you so much, Daniele. Can you see the black slides and you can hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. So thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you so much for having me and for being here, everyone. So I will talk about a topic that's maybe not so common in this research seminar series, but I think it's nevertheless interesting, and it's a more theoretical topic which I link back to genealogy. So first, I give you a structure of what I'm going to talk about. So first, I'll introduce a general kind of frame why I think this is interesting and relevant, and I'll try to be very brief. And I will also briefly say what kind of question I tried to tackle and in what kind of framework. And then most of the time I will spend on two arguments. One is largely historical and one is conceptual. So the first one, I will look at solidarity at a time when it emerges as a concept, and I will look at a particular thinker in particular. And secondly, I will propose a distinction which actually argues that there are two concepts of solidarity, and I will then, in the end, put that in a broader frame of European discussions today. So, as an introduction, and I mean, this is kind of, I mean, you're probably all aware of this, but I still wanted to stress it. It's simply empirically interesting that this concept is used so much in the European Union, of course, but also globally. So, since we're linked to the Schuman Center, I chose to start with a quote from Robert Schuman, who of course argued that the European Union we made through a de facto sort of solidarity. That's a specific notion of solidarity. And I chose another quote from Ursula von der Leyen, that solidarity is very much at the heart of the Union, but there are myriads of examples and that you could use to stress the relevance of it. But I'm interested in the link to crisis, also historically, so how this concept actually gets forged in crisis? What's the relation to it? And of course, we see this also today, that the contemporary crises have very much triggered this concept as a narrative during crisis. And I also want to stress this in the COVID-19 context, not in order to be kind of too easy about it, or to create an artificial link. This will actually be relevant in my historical claim, because there is a link to science and solidarity around the turn of the century, which is surprisingly contemporary and similar. So it's not just a kind of, you know, random piece of information. It's actually linked to something I'm going to say in the first part. So, and for those working in political theory, there's of course also something as another context within academia, very much an interest in solidarity as a concept and potentially a value depending on your definition. So in particular, that's the case in comparison, like it's particularly underdeveloped in comparison to liberty and equality, where there's a lot written about, in comparison at least. So to give you a kind of sense of the narrative I'm trying to establish, normally, also within the discourses in the EU, not only during crisis, but also in some of the treaties, at least, it's often conceived of as a kind of identity-based notion. So it's often, if you look at the migration crisis, for example, seen as a national kind of solidarity that's based on a set of feelings and identities. That's at least the kind of thing I'm seeing as normally the main kind of definition of scope that people also in public discourse tend to think about solidarity. And what I'm going to argue is that there's actually something more fundamental behind it. And that's largely linked to not only a socioeconomic conception, which is also very common in the contemporary discourse, but actually one, and that might hopefully surprise you, that is actually grounded in science, in the scientific advancement at the turn of the century. And that's also the link to the notion in the pandemic. I'll not spend too much time on it, but I think it's a very interesting claim. It's also completely novel. It's that's a paper that really, I think it's never been linked to this kind of condition at all. I don't think it's been so far explored. So that's for me, at least for historically minded researchers, it's a very interesting finding, I think. So what I'm trying to do is take a step back from the contemporary discourse on solidarity and look at it in a genealogical perspective. That means I kind of try to uncover another tradition of thought and apply that to the contemporary usage of the term. So genealogical method more generally looks at how concepts have changed over time, and then how you can critically use them in contemporary discourse. Since I don't ask what is solidarity in a essentialist sense or in an ontological sense even, but actually how is it formed and what kind of conditions discursively were there in order to facilitate specific interpretations of it. So it's a bit of a different framing. So I'm not, for example, asking what's the voters' attitudes towards European solidarity. So these are the two questions I'm looking at. And I will now come to the first part of the argument. And I will start with a more sort of broad idea of what it actually, where it kind of arises. So for example, if you look at the N-gram viewer, kind of a longitudinal analysis, you see that solidarity really arises at the 19th century and peaks more and more. We have data only until 2019, but I'm sure after the last year, it will be even more peak. So that's already an interesting kind of very ad hoc empirical observation. But it is really a response to the modern condition in many ways. So I should say one thing just in order to kind of get the etymology straight, and everyone that worked on this topic knows this, but it really originates in Roman law, where in solidum, where the term actually comes from, is a notion of debt, and more specifically a legalist notion of collective debt, which very much refers to a liability that a group has, an individual member of a group has inferred, and everyone kind of has to stand in. So if you want to make it a bit easier, you can kind of say it means to be bound like a solid body and be responsible for the debt of the entire group. That's kind of where it comes from in the etymological sense, but it shifted at the turn of the century. And that's a time where really you have modern political economy. The welfare state is about to emerge in many ways. You have largely individualist markets and at least perceived threat of traditional bonds of communities. So if you want to see modernity as a social cultural shift away from, for example, religion, family ties, and kinship towards liberal individualism, then this is very much a response to it. So that's the kind of historical context. Because the modern condition in this way would kind of, the question arises, how kind of to create a bond between individuals. In that sense, it's also very contemporary. And the main and largely forgotten conception that was important at the time is actually a very popular pamphlet. So this is, so Léon Bourgeois was Prime Minister of France. He also received the Nobel Prize for peace because he was, he acted in a very pacifist manner, but also was the I think first president of the League of Nations, so the prime organization for the United Nations. And he was at the time actually more influential than the accounts we normally refer to, such as Durkheim, whose very famous account of solidarity is still in the curricula in any sociology kind of undergrad degree, I would guess. So, and he very much comes in at a time where the general political atmosphere kind of needs that expression for a way to, administer social bonds or create unity in that kind of sense. And that was very much a pamphlet he wrote on solidarity and has a specific conception. I will now show you what this conception is, and then show you what the conditions for it are. And then in the second part, go to the distinction I want to make regarding solidarity generally. So in his account, and there's obviously a lot more to say, but I'm just going to give you the three kind of points that I think are central, because they are, again, I think utterly contemporary. So the idea is that basically human beings are born into society as always related to the society as such. So ontologically, if you want, the social precedes the political, and there's simply like a factual interdependence, such as, of course, the division of labor, which is central for Durkheim, for example. And he portrays this relationship as a debt relationship. So you actually have relations between individuals that are largely framed as debtor and creditor. And because they are framed as debtor and creditor, they can be also framed as a legal relationship and can be translated into welfare and public health policy. This is in many ways maybe the origin of social law proper in terms of social rights, but it's also very much at the beginning of the modern welfare state. So this sort of led if you want to go back to our early legalist origin, it kind of goes into politics and returns to like it comes from law, if you want, and then returns to the law via politics, namely via social policy reform. And in the sort of genealogical tradition, I would look at the conditions that are important here, but I will not get into detail, even though they are, in my opinion, very interesting, but it would, I think, take too much time to actually do this. I think there are three main conditions, which again, I'm very happy to talk about longer, but I think it's just not the time for it. But they are linked to crisis, that's why I'm showing them. So the first one is what we kind of, I think, often forget, that there was the Great Depression. It's normally referred to now as the Long Depression, because obviously in the 1930s, there was what we now call the Great Depression. So there was a moment really of economic crisis. And it's important to understand because that's kind of where it sort of becomes relevant. In between socialism and economism, so where you have a very strong laissez-faire idea of the market, for example. The second is Darwinian evolutionary theory, which is also very fascinating, but I also not going to go into in more detail. It is really something that much of the vocabulary of the sciences at that time draw on. And there's a lot to say about it. In a way, for Bourgeois, the struggle for existence kind of gets replaced by solidarity in order to be efficient for human beings. And there's also modern organicism, which again, I won't go too long into, but I think that's maybe the one you are most familiar with. So the idea that human society is largely in analogy with an organism. So if you have an organization like the EU, it's kind of the big organism, then you have societies or demoi, and then you have individuals that are analogous to the cells of an organism. And that's a very influential idea at the time. So it's the idea that progressive development would more and more lead to increased differentiation, such as in the division of labor, and then lead to a stronger glue of solidarity between people. And that's the thing I want to briefly get a bit more into detail in. It's a forgotten condition, which I already mentioned. It's something that I think has really not been explored whatsoever. And that is Louis Pasteur's bacteriology. So if you read Bourgeois a bit more in detail, especially his pamphlets, his conference papers, and also his later work on solidarity, he's really grounding his notion of solidarity, which again, I should say, or should emphasize again, is really the first proper theorization of solidarity. So, the modern concept very much has there its first politically relevant moment, at least so I claim. And that one is actually based on a scientific idea of biological interdependence. Again, I'm not going to go into much detail what the bacteriological foundation is, but if you think of Adam Smith with a division of labor being established in political economy writing, then you have in the scientific side biology, which very much establishes this interdependence on a much more fundamental level, because it's really about biology, so human beings as such, if you want. So this is really what Bourgeois really portrays Pasteur as the father of this doctrine. And I should say, just to make you understand kind of what the effect on the imagination of the time was. So microbes and bacteriology, and again here you have the link to COVID if you want. It's maybe a bit too easy, but it's very interesting to think about it in this way. So before you had, of course, different explanations for diseases and contagious diseases. Yeah? So, and with this new sort of discovery of microbes, you really had suddenly the idea that everyone is invisibly connected. So there would be people actually describing it as a countless army of little things that are everywhere, and everyone's scared of it. And this is normally called the germs. And this is really a connection for every living being. So you have the idea that everyone is interdependent, hence has duties to act in a specific way. So that was the foundation for specific ideas about public health policy at the time. And this is what I'm getting to now. So Bourgeois actually went a step further and really translated it into public policy. So not only welfare policy, but also public health policy in the early 20th century. So what's important here is that it's a specific solidarist ontology. So you don't start with the individual, and that becomes important for concepts of solidarity later, but you actually start with a collective idea of what human beings, how they sort of interact in society. So it's kind of the opposite, if you want, from Rousseau. So in the end, you end up with a free individual, but it first has to undergo the sort of solidarist ontological underpinning that you need. So you don't start with singularities or monads or individuals, but rather the other way around. And yeah, I'm not going to go into detail about what it means for the state, but really the state then has its very basis is to actually administer these social bonds. So it's a different view on the state as well, for example, against Hobbes quite explicitly so. But again, I'm not going to go into too much detail here because I don't have that much time if I want to speak about my actual distinction that I draw from this. And I'm sure we can talk more about these actual sort of historical parts in the discussion. But what's interesting, and again, utterly contemporary, is that this notion of debt is intrinsically intergenerational. So the idea is really to link the present societies and their policies to future ones. So if you think about the notion of climate or environmental debt, that is very interesting that it's already sort of very strongly there at this time. And it's also a link between the individual level or micro-sociological, if you want, and the broader economy. So, and then in the end, and that's about it for the kind of first part, the idea is, which is also interesting in terms of a gendered version that you normally have in the triad of the French Revolution, because you have fraternité, which obviously is male and often used as brotherhood, you can, in bourgeois terms, you can really replace it with solidarity, and you then change the order. So here in his pamphlet, he actually says that this should be the first one and then the others. So that's kind of the idea. And then the state very much becomes a sort of, let's say, instrument for social justice. So now that's a conception, a specific conception of solidarity that I would say is very different from the way we normally think about it. It has its dangers that I'm not going to talk about now, but they are also there. It has a tendency for very technocratic sort of governance and can be also problematic in many ways, but it's very interestingly founded in factual interdependence. And that's the main thing I want to take away from this, apart from the historically interesting fact that it's actually grounded in many ways in scientific thought and bacteriology. So the takeaway is that first of all, it's a distinctly modern concern. Like solidarity as a concept really arises at the turn of the century, and it's historically related, and I would argue actually continues to be related to the notion of debt. And it's also interesting in terms of conceptual analysis more generally that concepts are forged during crisis in a specific way. So you have an economic crisis, for example, at the turn of the century that then triggers a response in terms of solidarity. So in that way, it kind of contributes to literature and policy effects of ideas. But we learn also something else, and that's what I'm going to talk about now, which is the proposition I have, drawing on this at least partly historical analysis, and that is that we can actually, based on this, distinguish it from the notion we commonly use, which I mentioned at the beginning, so the identity feeling-based notion of solidarity. So in that one, in lack of better terms for it, I mean, you could also say it's a warm concept. You could call it identitarian concept of solidarity, but I suggest to distinguish between two concepts of solidarity, and one here again, in lack of better name, called thick solidarity, a thick concept of solidarity, which is very much grounded in identity. And again, then you can use that for example, discourse analysis. If you look at the European law traditions and how they use the term, how it's shifted. And it's very much structured along the lines of, if you again look at historical terms of it, along the lines of nationalism. So the classic take of Benedict Anderson, for example, an imagined community, that would very much be a warm line of tradition of solidarity. So feelings of belonging, for example, communal relations. If you want, in 20th century political theory terms, you could say it's also linked to communitarianism. So that's the first distinction I want to make, where you really have a group identification and a strong demand in terms of moral and political responsibilities, at least much stronger than the one we've just seen, the historical original one that relates to factual interdependence. You can, for example, just to use a very famous notion, there can be a call for a sacrifice of liberty in the name of the nation. And as Renan, for example, has made that claim very famously. And my critique of it is, and that's very sort of maybe obvious, but it's historically and conceptually relevant, that it's inherently oppositional. So if you use this as, for example, a model for the EU, and we'll come back to that later, it has it's inherently exclusive character. Some theorists say it's partitive, you can say it's oppositional, exclusive, but it definitely creates a strong bond, which in the final analysis will have an exclusionary tendency because of its reliance on identity. That's a strong difference to contractual relations and economic reasoning, for example. And again, the exclusive character also comes into play because the vision sort of, and also the vision of Europe then, is not a cosmopolitan one in the sense that you extend this community to the rest of the world, but rather you actually maintain its exclusive character in order to forge these thick bonds of solidarity. And that's largely emotionally based. So that's the main story I was referring to in the beginning. It's a set of feelings, if you want. And then what of course, as the opposition to it. And I should also say that these are ideal types. So as the ideal typical opposition to it, I would call the other one the thin concept of solidarity. So that's the one we were just looking at in its original form. So it's really about factual interdependence, can be based on science, can also be division of labor, as we have seen, so kind of economic interdependence. But it's an expression of social political organization. So you might call this joint action or a common goal that binds people together. Another important example is the one I referred to in the beginning, which is de facto solidarity. So the idea that institutional settings actually trigger obligations for an institutional organization or polity, or an international organization. So, but still, and that's also important to understand, it's still, I'm still talking about solidarity, so it's not a thin sense of a mere market liberalism. So if you want to take the strong forms of, for example, neoliberal thought, you would basically end up with individuals that are completely debt-free, if we want to talk about debt. So you would be equal in precisely that aspect, that you're free of debt and born without these responsibilities whatsoever. So here you still have more, but it's not as based on identity as the thick version. And that has a tradition of thought, which is we could call cold, which is then maybe interesting that I, at least implicitly, prefer this tradition because it sounds, of course, kind of negative. And most people would argue for the other way around. What this meant in Bourgeois' case also is a policy for progressive income tax. So that's an example that is very much grounded in this tradition. So now we talked, so I mentioned that I think it's linked to debt, and we talked about, so what the question then is, how do they relate to this, to the obligations of debt more generally? And in the thicker version, it's really triggered by the identity that you have. So you owe something to someone because you very much identify with the group. And in the thin version, it's a bit more complicated. It's kind of self-imposed rules that very much are triggered by the general interdependence that then what Bourgeois called the debt social, so social debt that you have towards society per se. And again, I should stress that these are really ideal types, so they're not mutually exclusive. They can coexist, and that's the important kind of point. They're not created ex nihilo, but they're grounded in the genealogy of the concept as such. So then I actually spoke pretty much half an hour, so we can now get to the final part. And again, I left many parts of the historical discussion kind of under the table, so I'm very happy to get back to them in the discussion. So what you could make from this, and I'm not suggesting to just take historical analysis and kind of use them for a normative theory of solidarity in the EU, but you could still use it as a descriptive analysis for discourse analysis. So if you look at the law, for example, it is useful to distinguish them because they are often confused in our contemporary discourse. So you often have a single concept of solidarity being pushed forward, but you don't actually see which one of the two is meant. That's the kind of most direct usefulness of it. But you could also argue, at least implicitly, against the thick version of it. So for the EU, it might be preferable to actually talk about factual interdependence and not about identity regarding solidarity. That's one idea you could draw from this. So because it has this sort of exclusionary and moralizing tendencies, it could be a more suitable way to actually think about contractual relations, which might be sufficient for solidarity in the EU. The problem with it is, as I just said, that often policy fields tend to sort of purposefully mix the concepts in order to push forward political claims. So it's kind of, it can be used for political ends to forge artificial bonds of identity, for example. In the debt crisis, you could say that the moralization of debt, which in principle is kind of an economic notion, but was very much moralized, and that's kind of along the lines of a thicker sense of solidarity. So if you trigger obligations under the name of solidarity in a moralized kind of way, then that's what I would refer to as the thick version. And if we think about the ongoing and long discussion about visions of European solidarity and also visions of the nature of the EU, they're often, what I would say all the time, there's this kind of solidarity of positions. On the one hand, people argue that distributive policies between member states should be there, but then on the other, and they refer to solidarity. On the other hand, arguments are often put forward that such policies would in the end undermine national solidarity within member states. So that's the kind of trade-off that's often put forward. But in the end, it might be that it's just our confused language. So if you conceive of the EU rather in a sense of union, in the thin sense that I've outlined, rather than unity in the thick sense, then actually it doesn't disappear, but it's just a different kind of concept that you're referring to. So generally, I would at least implicitly kind of argue that fractional independence and reciprocity might be a better guide than grounding it in unity. Another one, and I should quickly say this, is of course I mean, if you think about the no-demos thesis, that's a similar kind of very classic argument that argues that in the end, you have a kind of lack of transnational political belonging between individuals in the EU. Hence, there cannot be a traditional form of democracy and solidarity proper. And you could argue that maybe a thin version is actually sufficient. So, and I would conclude with saying that the historical debate is really interesting, that they fit so well with the contemporary intergenerational aspect. So again, if you think of environmental and distributional conflicts, the 21st century, it's really interesting to think of them in a way of the social debt that was proposed at the turn of the century in terms of solidarity in order to overcome inequality. So that's it's really utterly contemporary. But it also just generally points to the resonance of the concept of solidarity in the 21st century, but at least in my view, also to the relevance of its genealogy. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Rouven. It was an excellent presentation, very interesting, perfect timing as well. I am also very happy that EGPP wants to have a multidisciplinary seminar series, and you address sociological and historical questions, and this complements very nicely what has been presented in other sessions. So thank you very much again. The floor is open now for reactions, questions, comments. You can write in the chat, or you can raise your hand. Yes, I see Anton Emmerich. Please go ahead.
Yes, Rouven, thank you very much. I really liked your presentation, and I like the writings that lie behind it. So we've had this discussion a little bit before. So I mean, what you really emphasize very strongly, and I think you could do a little bit more on that, is that bourgeois builds on Durkheim, but goes beyond Durkheim in a way. So Durkheim, in his critique on Adam Smith, in terms of interdependence, he basically says, you know, these workers who are at this construction belt should have the same language, the same morals. So he's really shaping the cement in cultural and identity terms in order to make the division of labor work. Now, for bourgeois, it's the interdependence that comes with the division of labor that needs some kind of insurance, right? I mean, that's the interdependence needs to be managed, and therefore you need to have something of an insurance contract. I'm not sure the concept of that is well chosen. Anyway, so you have these two ideal types, and I think that works rather well. But once you move to the 21st century, it's this kind of mixture of the two that really defines the expansion of the welfare state, right? I mean, there's on the one hand, this sort of discovery of interdependence and the need for insurance. You have health insurance and disability insurance and pensions, and this is all framed in this kind of Beveridgean way that actually, you know, when you do this kind of insurance, you make it collective, everybody pays in. It even has a stabilization function. So again, very much from this interdependence point of view. But it's an open contract, right? I mean, it's not per se stable. So both in building it and when things go wrong, as with the Great Depression, you still need to hark back on identity. So yes, we all pay into the insurance funds, but now we have German unification. We have, we have to support the East. So now we introduce an element of solidarity that is, a solidarity from us to them, and you cannot get away with something a little thicker than what the insurance contract, which is open, has to offer. And so the welfare state is both a technocratic project, but also a project of nation building. And then, when things work well, with, some kind of pension scheme, then, that pension scheme becomes element of pride that we built this and we all buy into it. And then it becomes part of national identity in a way. So, you end your story to say, there are two views on solidarity, and it's better to think about the thin stuff on solidarity when we talk about the EU. And I think in pragmatic terms, that's pretty wise. And maybe it's a little bit thicker at the national level, but, in times of crisis, that's when the social contract or when the insurance contract no longer works. The only way to reinsure the contract in a way can only be solved with an element of an appeal to a thicker type of solidarity. And I think you do not really reflect on this dilemma in a way. So that would be my comment on what you do. But I think the contrast between bourgeois and Durkheim can be made a little bit more radical. And then you can take on the English discussion, with Beveridge, where you really go into this insurance logic. But I have to say, I'm not a philosopher.
Rouven, would you like to react?
Yeah, thank you so much, Anton. I mean, thanks. So it's really all very valid. The Durkheim part, I fully agree, and I also would have done that if there would have been more time. Durkheim is also interesting in its own kind of terms, not only because of his distinction, but also what I'm currently actually looking at, what that might mean in terms of, that might sound surprising, but external relations of Europe. So the notions of organic and mechanical solidarity are often seen as a transition from pre-modernity to modernity, but actually it might be that actually the sort of colonial lands were very much the model amongst these are actually built. So that's an interesting part that also is a very strong contrast to bourgeois. But I fully agree. So like the contrast is strong, and I should do it more, which I'm also doing in one of the papers. The point about bourgeois, I just want to add, which I also haven't mentioned, but it's very central. Actually, there are two central theoretical claims he makes. One is or at least I would say so. One is the idea that there is a social debt, which I have outlined. And yeah, I mean, Anton, your criticism that this might not be wisely chosen, I'm not, maybe. I think it's actually rather catchy as a phrase, but it might be true. The other one is certainly catchy, and that's the quasi-contract. So because you refer to the contractual tradition. So for him, very much that idea is based on the quasi-contract, which again is kind of a philosophically smart move, because it is a tradition of social contract theory in a way, but it escapes the sort of explicit contract that you need. It's simply already kind of given in, for example, welfare arrangements that he wishes to put forward. Again, for that you don't necessarily need an identity. Even though, of course, I should also say this transfer doesn't really. I mean, you're completely right. That refers to your second point. Of course, when you go into the 21st century, this is very. It's a very ad hoc application of this. There's so much changes. It's also conceptually. But I mean, yeah, that's of course a transition that is difficult. And that's why I mentioned this, like he doesn't, I mean, the whole idea about identity in that kind of strong sense in the welfare state obviously arises much later. So that's anyway not the focus of his writing. And the last point I think is maybe I find maybe the most interesting one. So whether or not you need a sort of identity underpinning for the welfare state, or let's also say because you asked the question, let's say, social investment. I'm not sure if you really do, because especially when you want to split it across the European, I mean, if you want to look at the European Union, Frank Vandenbroek also had the distinction between kind of pan-European solidarity and the national ones, and then you could very well have a sort of, let's say, easy version where you have both, but one is rather on the national level and one is on the international one. So you could have your thick idea of underpinning for welfare policies, but on the national level. That would be the easy kind of solution to that question, if that makes sense.
Yes. Thank you, Rouven. I have Adrien Ritier next on the list. Adrien, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rouven, for a very, very interesting presentation. My questions, two questions, link up to what has been already touched upon to some extent. That is the one of the boundaries of within which you can get the redistribution in order to guarantee solidarity. Where would you draw these boundaries? You talked about the national level, the European level, but also now in your responses to the international level. But of course, it would assume that within these boundaries, wherever you place them, there is this willingness to, between losers and winners, for the losers, right, to give something in order to give something to those who the have-nots, if you say it very flatly. So how could that be guaranteed with a particular social political infrastructure in order to create this European Union, not to speak even of the entire world, right, where you would need this type of solidarity? And that leads me, of course, to the second point. We don't talk very much about the type of good which is at stake. Is it kind of a common good where there is danger of free riding? So you have to, the classical prisoner's dilemma question, and you have to issue rules in order to exclude moral hazard. So these are two questions which you didn't mention very much in your talk, and I would be curious to hear more about them.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm afraid to these two questions, I don't have very good answers. So the first one, because both relate to more contemporary kind of policy questions and to normative theory, which I don't really sort of propose. So I think for both, I can't really sort of propose what the boundaries would be in terms of actual redistribution of policies. So since it's a historically grounded genealogy, it's more something like a proposition for analysis that is largely descriptive. So it would not be something that actually leads to a proposition in terms of, for example, boundaries, whether they are national or international for redistribution. So that would also be, I guess, not really possible on a genealogical reading to ground it on it. That to me sounds, I mean, it's probably just impossible, and I'm at least not doing it. But I understand the problem and the question, which I again can't really address. And the second question, I have to say kind of the same thing, because what type of good is at stake? Of course, you would basically see it as or at least commonly see it either as a value, so solidarity as such, or as, again, a set of feelings or something like a human capacity, which is much more sort of more fundamental than a good that is at stake in cases of moral hazard or free riding. So it's more, in that sense, a kind of more philosophical take. That's a very, that's not a very good answer. I'm well aware of this. Like, I think the transfer to policy is rather difficult, in my view, I would say. So it's more linked to like the theoretical general kind of debate what solidarity is. Even though I would say that in the end, to make it more thick, so to speak, you would probably need that. So I very much agree with the critique.
Okay, thank you, Rouven. I have on my list now Philippe Van Parijs, Hans-Peter Krisi, and Philippe Genschel. Philippe Van Parijs is next.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And thank you, Rouven, for your presentation. And And congratulations, because the concept of solidarity is incredibly tricky. I spent part of the last summer struggling with it, and including for a paper on European solidarity, the proof of which I have to correct today. So that's why I wanted to attend your session in order to get some help. Now I have a suggestion, which is at least at the same time an expression of some perplexity, which seems to me that there are two distinctions that you run together and that I think should be kept separate in their best interpretation. There is one that is the distinction between solidarity as mutual dependence versus solidarity as mutual responsibility. And in fact, you have in Léon Bourgeois' little booklet, Solidarité, you already have these two notions. The first notion is purely factual. It is in fact Schuman or the Schuman-Monet notion of solidarité de fait. It's a sheer fact. Bourgeois even speaks about solidarity between stars because of the gravity, laws of gravity. Then there is solidarity as mutual responsibility, which can be, in the extreme case, a duty, a moral duty, in a weaker sense, a desirable disposition. And in Bourgeois, frankly, sometimes you have clearly a sort of what philosophers call a naturalistic fallacy, where he says that because of the mutual dependence, you have a mutual responsibility. Of course, I mean, this is jumping from facts to value. But anyway, whether or not he makes that fallacy, the two things need to be kept distinct. Solidarity as mutual dependence versus solidarity as a motive or at the limit as a duty. That's one distinction. And then there is the other distinction, and which you treat then in parallel, which is between warm and cold. To my knowledge, this distinction was first made in those terms by Pierre Rosanvallon, and there the distinction is between the warm solidarity as a spontaneous solidarity between individuals, where you act out of solidarity. It can also happen between states, and that's the warm solidarity, versus the cold solidarity, which is incorporated in our institutions, in particular the institutions of our welfare state, but also conceivably in some rules that are then created at the level of the European Union between states. And so, and these two things, these two distinctions, I think are really don't overlap. So, and whenever we act out of solidarity with other people, there is always some sort of notion of common identity. We act with other people by virtue of their being Europeans, or by virtue of their being academics whose academic freedom is being threatened, or whatever. And so there will always be, and there's a key difference between solidarity and charity, for example, that there is this sort of egalitarian relationship between people who show solidarity. So my central conceptual point is really that there are these two distinctions which seem to me important. I had to struggle hard. That's why I have a lot of empathy for you to try to sort this out in the light of sometimes confusing literature. And so, and on the one hand, between solidarity as a sheer fact of mutual dependence, and then solidarity as mutual responsibility, which is a moral concept. And then on the other hand, a thick versus, on the other hand, warm versus cold. And of course, there is a relationship between warm and cold, as Anton just suggested also, because the cold solidarity of our welfare state somehow needs to be supported by a sufficiently warm, a sufficiently strong warm solidarity to make it politically sustainable. And so I just finished with and what seems to me crucial then for European solidarity, and that was well put by Klaus Hofer in one of his papers on solidarity, It's that, in fact, the solidarité, the fait, sheer interdependence step, the money method or whatever, gradually increased our interdependence. And this interdependence calls for solidarity as mutual responsibility. First, as the warm solidarity between states, where we ask Germany, please come and help Greece, or certain northern countries come and help the countries that are have to face all the inflow of refugees. And then this warm solidarity, we must try to transform it into cold solidarity by formalizing this mutual responsibility. And so that seems, this is a suggestion about how to try to think about what's key then for European solidarity. I mean, that goes in a way along the same lines as what Anton was suggesting before.
Thank you so much. I mean, that's super helpful. I mean, because you're very familiar with with this whole literature, and you've written so much on solidarity yourself, so you know very well that one of the, I think, problems in this discourse is that everyone suggests a lot of different notions on it, and then you end up with many terms that attempt to distinguish something, and in the end, it's not necessarily helpful to have a list. In my view, it's not necessarily helpful to have a list of 20 conditions, which then allow you to speak of solidarity. So that's very common these days in political theory. So my point was kind of to be, to use a businessy term, kind of lean about it, and of course bundle different things together. I completely agree with your distinction, but the idea was to actually not overload it and have two ideal types that struck me as the most relevant distinction. And then the others would of course come in. There are many additional notions that are relevant. For example, in one of your papers, you talk about economic solidarity, which again is a bit different. There are so many ways of then transferring it to the European level. You can, I mean, there's just so much that you can talk about. But once, so my idea was, once you start that it's completely too obscure. So like the idea was to have something more similar and to use. That's why I also briefly mentioned, if I mention the Isaiah Berlin, so the idea that you have two concepts of liberty, of course, not claiming to be as ingenious as he was, but the idea was to write a similar paper, which has a very similar rhetoric actually, to distinguish different questions that relate to solidarity, like he did for the Cold War ideologies, and use that for today. So that's not so much what I presented today, but that's kind of the idea. So to use the really ideal, typical Weberian kind of sense. But still, I think your critique is completely right, and maybe then in the end I would need to end up with actually 4, which already I kind of wanted to avoid. That there are many different, kind of ways to get into a very long list. I'm not sure about the natural fallacy point is one of the very common critiques. I personally also think that bourgeois has a very mixed up style of, not only style of writing, but also conceptual usage. So it's not only these two, but also the quasi-contract remains largely in many ways very obscure. So does the notion of social debt. It's also in many ways a politician talking, I would say. So it's also very rhetorical. But I'm not entirely sure if the natural fallacy completely holds for this if you don't want to trigger a strong moral sense of obligations. If you simply kind of claim a very weak sense of responsibility, whether or not that might actually work without committing a natural fallacy in philosophical terms, I'm not entirely convinced that it's really the main problem here. I mean, maybe you can show me that it really is. I'm not entirely convinced. So, for example, in Andreas Sangiovanni's conception, you would also have a kind of joint action solidarity that's not necessarily built on an identity notion, for example. The Rosan-Vallon point is also very interesting, especially because he's kind of the only person I mentioned in the beginning that hardly anyone has actually spoken about this Pasteur influence. He doesn't really do it, but he kind of does it. Like here in his History of the Welfare State, I didn't know he distinguishes between warm and cold, I have to admit, but he very much refers to these traditions and also mentioned Pasteur. Again, it's the same problem I had with it. If you talk about spontaneous solidarity, which is quite popular in policy these days, I've seen many policy papers at least that use this and claim it as a value needed for policy reform in the EU. I'm not so sure if that works really well as the warm side and the institutional as the cold side, because then you miss the other distinctions that I wanted to make. But yeah, he's obviously, I mean, someone I do draw on in the historical part in many ways. Sorry, this answer is very long, but you have also some interesting points. I mean, again, I should really rethink this, and also that relates back to Anton, because I don't really know if I'm not sure if I have a position on this, that what you were saying, and Anton kind of hinted towards, that there's always identity in it. I just mentioned like Andreas' conception, but I think that generally you don't necessarily need a form of identity for it, and especially not on a international, or like, let's say, an EU level. That's at least not necessarily, I mean, okay, that's very much at the heart of the debate of the visions of Europe that I kind of refer to. Of course, you can say you kind of need it. But I wouldn't say that I'm entirely convinced that you need it for solidarity. And I also, in the main distinction to charity, I would say historically is very much a religious underpinning, and not so much whether or not it's related to identity, at least in my understanding of it. So that's how I distinguish them. And the Klaus Offer point, yeah, that's super helpful. It's been a long time that I read this, but that's a very interesting claim, because it relates so much to Schuman. I mean, in the end, that's a very top-down notion then, which is in a way kind of starting with the sort of thin cold idea that then kind of creates a warmer sort of community on the lower kind of level. But it's super helpful. I should probably reread it too. And whether this, then the question is, so if you don't commit a similar thing, what you called natural fallacy, because if you end up with mutual responsibility, then you kind of, I mean, how is that, what's the basis for it? It just emerges, I assume. So you just kind of, you end up with it because it's created by the institutional setting, if I got you right.
Would you like to rejoin?
Just no, I mean, there are other people wanting to ask questions. I'll just make one methodological suggestion or advice, and be careful about ideal types, because ideal types sometimes there is a temptation of sort of getting into woolly thinking by lumping things together that needs to be distinguished. I have a general attitude in favor of thin concepts against fat concepts, where you bundle too many things together that, in fact, logically and often empirically don't always go together. So, but I'll let other people ask questions.
Okay, thank you very much. I had Hans-Peter Krisi on my list.
Yeah, what I wanted to say is maybe redundant now, but the distinction, I like very much the distinction you make between thick and thin. The thin one you call de facto, I would call it functional, dominated by the efficiency logic, whereas the other one is dominated by the community logic. And I mean, Philip will say something similar, I imagine, because I take these concepts from a paper he wrote recently with Jachtenfuchs. What I think is important is that you say maybe the functionalist solidarity or the thin solidarity is enough at the EU level, but the functionalist solidarity or interdependence competes with the thick solidarity or the community-based solidarity that exists already. So you are not introducing the functional solidarity on a blank sheet. You are introducing it in a situation where you already have the nation states and identity community-based solidarity. And these are at counter purposes and in conflict with each other. Your technocratic solidarity is too much in an ideal world and not in a real conflictive situation.
Rouven, would you like to react
Yeah.
immediately? Or
yes. I mean, so I actually, I do refer to this as functional. It's probably, it might be the better term than de facto. I just used it here for the presentation because it was related to Schuman. And it also captures the point I was trying to make. I guess you're referring to the paper that Philip presented, probably was the session before, no? The post-functionalism paper, I guess. So so sure. I mean, in order to sort of link it back to these terms, yes, that makes perfect sense. The competition is kind of so again, I mean, there's really maybe a danger to transfer this sort of more conceptual thing to the EU, which was clear in the questions before as well. And now again, because maybe it just doesn't kind of correspond with it. The point was kind of that there is this competition, right? You have different types, but that our language is kind of confused and they are actually conceptually different. So you should actually distinguish them sort of in analysis. So that's kind of the toolkit points that you wouldn't refer to both. So the national solidarity and the, in this case, the functional one in the same term, and hence create confusion. That's kind of like the implicit sort of analytical takeaway. But I completely agree. And I'm not, again, that was the point I was just trying to make. I'm not actually arguing for a large scale sort of technocratic sense of solidarity. It's just an analytical distinction that I thought is interesting because it can be grounded in, at least I think, in historical lines of traditions of thinking about solidarity. But thanks a lot for the comment, Hans-Peter. I will continue thinking about it.
Yes, and Philip Genschel happens to be next. Things fall into place perfectly.
Thank you. Actually, I wanted to go back to Philip and what he said about the dangers of bundling. And, you introduce since solidarity as interdependence-based or now as function-based, but in fact, there's more going on than just interdependence. There's more going on than just repeated play and tit for tat and all that. Because as you say, when introducing the concept, it goes beyond mere rational self-interest. So even for thin solidarity, you need a sense of responsibility. For some reason, a person and an actor in a better position has to feel obliged to help a person in a worse position. And the question is, where does this feeling of responsibility come from? And now we talked about communities, history, etc., identity, but it may also be very issue specific, and it may be the trigger, the risk that puts a person in need of help at risk that determines whether the person in the better position feels responsible or not. So if a person is in a bad situation for sheer bad luck, the likelihood that this will trigger a feeling of responsibility in others is higher than if this person is in a bad situation for his or her own fault. So the difference between the debt crisis and the COVID crisis was that the debt crisis was narrated as crisis countries being in crisis for their own policy fault. So Greek pursued the wrong policy, and now why should we bail them out? Whereas with COVID, you had a completely different narrative. It was the narrative countries or people in a bad position could be us. In a way, by helping them, we help us. And that made a difference in this fusion of debt and disease allowed for a level of, cold solidarity in the end that was impossible to institutionalize during the Eurozone crisis. Related to that, there's this question of symmetry. Are all people at about the same level of risk, or is risk distributed very asymmetrically? So if there's high symmetry in risk, I would assume that the feeling of responsibility is stronger than if there is high asymmetry. So in short, you know, wouldn't you also have to introduce, you know, the source of risk in order to theorize which of your solidarities will be triggered?
I can only kind of agree. I mean the risk point is kind of related to the what Hans-Peter now called functional, but like the thin version, because you of course would have that. I mean, you have that even actually in bourgeois suggests a differentiated version. So for example, the most affected by inequalities would receive more. So you have, for example, a progressive income tax, but also a kind of active sense of seeing that. I mean, you don't have to call that asymmetrical risk, but in a way, you have at least the basis for that. So I agree with that. But it's an important question, and also it should be probably, I mean, introduced in the conceptual framework if you really want to apply it to something like European crisis, because you're right, then it plays a central role. And for the other 2 points, I can just agree. I mean, the death and COVID crisis probably were distinguished by these factors. I used the COVID crisis, as I said, for rhetorical purposes at the very beginning, because I thought it's extremely interesting that this sort of medical interdependence sense that very much triggered solidarity calls in contemporary discourse was actually very similar at the turn of the century 100 years ago. So that was it's not an analysis of the COVID crisis. It was a rhetorical kind of take on it, because I thought it's quite fascinating that it already then triggered explicitly calls for solidarity and even a conception for it. But I completely agree with your analysis. Yeah, thanks a lot, though. I mean, I will think about the risk specific notion more. It sounds like it's a good idea. So thanks a lot.
Thank you. I'm not sure if Adrien wants to ask. No.
Yes, I have a short follow-up question, which I find actually puzzling in the present development of COVID, that it's true with symmetric risks, as in the case of COVID, you have at first this solidaristic reaction, but it wears off very quickly. And in a second instance, third instance, as we see with the masks, as we see now with the vaccines, that's where, you know, the redistributive conflicts break open again very quickly. So that somehow the time dimension as a crisis hits and can cause forth a certain solidaristic reaction has to be considered in a little bit longer time frame.
Rouven, would you like to react?
Yeah, I agree. It's I mean, again, I didn't look at the COVID crisis in any kind of these senses. It's also, I mean, one of the problems that Philip van Parijs also pointed to, solidarity is also used in so many ways, and in this case also very rhetorically during the COVID crisis, that it's very difficult to distinguish whether or not, in this case, symmetrical risks actually triggered something that actually qualifies as solidaristic action proper. I don't know, I didn't do any analysis on it. You could, in this case, also say it's something like a much more thin version of something like fear of contagion or fear of, you know, your own kind of very, very self-interest in this case. So that could also be a trick. I'm just, you know, guessing, but it could be. What is interesting though, that in a discursive level that it wears off, and I agree, that was definitely the case. But again, the question is if you can even frame it as a solidaristic action in any kind of sense. It probably was in the sense that it had maybe a common goal. If you want to see a restabilization against COVID as that goal, then maybe yes. But thanks a lot for the comment. I mean, it's an interesting point. I should also say that I agree with the ideal typical danger of lumping things together. I'm normally also not a big fan of it, but sometimes I thought it makes sense to kind of make things, you know, into two ideal typical notions of the concept.
So we have time for more questions and comments. Philippe?
Yeah, perhaps two additional suggestions also to further complicate your story, but or perhaps solve at the same time solve some problems. One related to what was just said. So there is, of course, this step from warm solidarity to cold solidarity, which is important to stabilize solidarity, because it's also often said that after the wars, you have this sudden upsurge of the spontaneous warm solidarity of people towards each other, but this wouldn't last long if you didn't sort of crystallize it and solidify it in the form of institutions. And then you pay your progressive taxes or your social security contributions, not out of warm solidarity for the people you are thereby helping, but because you'll be punished if you try to not to pay what you have the legal obligation to pay. And so that I think, and so that's why I find that in the process of European integration, it's so important then to use these moments of warmer solidarity in order then to create lasting institutions that sort of will organize redistribution between the lucky and the less lucky, the well-off and the worse off in a stable way. And so that's one remark. And the other remark, of course, one related to several of the interventions, one connection which you must make somewhere in your paper, in your work, is the connection between solidarity and insurance. And of course, solidarity and insurance are both ways, setups, if they are practices or institutions, there are ways of helping people when they are hit by bad luck. And then the extent to which it's pure bad luck may vary considerably. And as Philip said before, and the more people can be held responsible for their bad situation, the less spontaneous solidarity will be forthcoming. And but also the more the permanent setups of solidarity or insurance will have to protect themselves against moral hazard. And so misbehavior on the part of the people who take advantage of the system in order thereby increasing the risk. And so that's and so these are my two suggestions, really, that there is the crucial important, related also to Klaus-Hoffer's point, the crucial importance of the movements that must constantly lead, or we must try to make lead, from warm solidarity to cold solidarity, even if cold solidarity looks a bit less nice than warm solidarity. That's one. And two, the importance of having redistributive systems that go beyond insurance, beyond sheer insurance for everyone's self-interest, in order to have some ex-ante redistribution which can count as true solidarity beyond insurance. And of course, one cannot talk, I think, about European solidarity without sort of thinking about these two aspects.
Rouven?
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I mean, it's very helpful. I find the stabilizing point generally very interesting in terms of the history of it, not only in the US. Some sometimes argue that actually solidarity should replace the position that peace once held in the integration process after the war. So you have a kind of long tradition of it, but I think it's a very interesting point. in the times of that I refer to here, you could refer to it in a kind of sense of, I mean, I would call it pathologies of solidarity, even, because you also have a negative sense of this, what you were referring to as crystallization, when it becomes in a kind of technocratic way, like the organicists kind of did, then you can easily transition to a sort of organicist vocabulary that makes it easy to use public health or generally the law, where you said you be legally punished, but it can also go sort of the other way. So you can, once you kind of harmonize the parts of society, at least around the turn of the century thinking, then you simultaneously kind of naturalize the differences. Like a physical organism, you kind of, like Aristotle said, like a line is a line. It's like this kind of thing. It needs to work together, like a physiological organism. But then you also have a tendency to potentially essentialize social and economic inequalities. But there's like also a danger that's also partly in bourgeois, I would say. So the stabilization thing can also, I think, be kind of, I mean, it can be problematic as well, I think, depending on how it works, of course. But I agree with your take of using the kind of warm moments to stabilize it. And yeah, the insurance I need to think about more. Same with the risk. It would be part of the thin side in this conception. Yeah. Thanks a lot for the comments. It's really helpful. I will look at it in more detail afterwards.
Can I maybe jump in here? Because you mentioned this technocratic, organicistic perspective on solidarity. I find this very interesting. In principle, it's an anti-pluralist vision of society. And I mean, I find this very, very problematic because we seem to forget that solidarity is something, the degree of solidarity within a society is something that is decided, something that is conflictual. Not everyone agrees or would agree to the same amount of solidarity that there should be between, let's say, individuals within a society or within states, within a multinational union. It's something that you can have more solidarity or less solidarity. In a way, solidarity is a correction of inequalities that happen to exist socially or naturally, or however you want to define it. So a political view or a pluralist view would be to say that you can have a degree of solidarity within, I mean, you could have full solidarity. I mean, totalitarian states like the Soviet Union probably are examples of this, and then you can have the other extreme, completely atomistic societies. But then society decides how much it wants of this solidarity. You can say a lot or not much. So you have different actors that probably push for more or less depending on their interest. And I think Adrienne was going into this direction. I can very well imagine that those who have are not so keen to let go what they have to redistribute, and the other way around. And this would be a very political view of solidarity. It's a cleavage, conflictual view of solidarity. But then you would have another one, how you make this decision. Because if you are a society, you make this decision as a society. You don't leave it to each one to decide how much do I want to sacrifice of what I have for the good of the others or for the good of the whole. So there must be a certain degree of imposition. Solidarity is not something that happens only spontaneously. Society needs to impose solidarity. So society needs to impose it. and this would be another political point of view, is that, I mean, to an extreme, to impose complete solidarity, you would need a very authoritarian state. So my question would be, how do these political considerations enter your reflections on solidarity? Is solidarity linked to certain authoritarianism, to a certain anti-pluralism, to a certain rejection of minority rights, to protect themselves against this imposed redistribution in the name of solidarity?
Yeah, thanks a lot. That's a very different kind of angle to it. So I don't have like, it's not something I sort of directly work on, but of course if you want the critique of any what we now call warm, but like the thick version is, of course, that it has an identitarian sense in that way. So it can be anti-pluralist in that kind of sense, but I'm not really talking about, for example, like authoritarian instigations that sort of then trigger solidarity. You could, I mean, that might lead a bit far, but if you want to sort of ground this distinction more in 20th century political philosophy, you could refer to people like, for a thick version, for example, to Carl Schmitt, where you would have that kind of version maybe in a legalist kind of imposing sense. That's something that would be possible. I would, in the framework we now use, that would be the thick version. So yeah, that's the kind of political sort of sense that you were pointing to, I guess. Whether or not it's sort of decided by society is maybe I mean, again, that depends on the conception then. I mean, if you like what Philippe von Paris was saying is, of course, more like that's you can only stabilize and crystallize it, of course, when you once had that sort of moment or movement in which, of course, it's not necessarily at least a society-wide kind of thing. So if you look at social movement literature, which refers a lot to solidarity, it's always a kind of, you know, group-based thing that is in maybe a capacity, maybe an effect of these movements, and they're not society-wide, of course. So I'm not sure if you need a sort of society-wide notion of it, or like if you even need it in order to decide about solidarity in a society. It could be that, for example, movements trigger it as well. But again, that's not. I can't you know, kind of refer to it in this conception.
Thank you. Anyone else who would like to jump in at this stage? We look at the.
I think
but not.
Yeah.
Or Philippe, maybe a very last, yes.
If I'm not abusing my time.
No, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
It's really but related to what Daniele just said, and so to spell out a bit this connection there might be between solidarity and authoritarianism. In fact, you have a mild version of it in the idea of conditionalities, including at the European level, that are linked to the implementation of solidarity, where the people who have to help the others said, well, either you behave exactly the way you want to behave, but then I feel no obligation to help you, or if you want me to help you, then you'll behave exactly the way I want you to behave. And so there's this sort of, and so you could say, well, either it's everyone does what he wishes, but then it's perfectly compatible with mutual indifference. But if you want solidarity, then you have to have a common vision about the proper way to behave. And of course, therefore, you may have this, and sometimes you have this dystopia of a totally solidaristic society, for example, in terms of healthcare. But people cannot smoke, they cannot do this, and they have a whole very restricted list of what they are allowed to do. And so, and there is also this aspect in solidarity, also related to what Philippe said, earlier, which is that it relates in two ways to responsibility, because in a way solidarity is responsibility for others, but for others who behave in a so-called responsible way. And the definition of a responsible way of behaving is, of course, then can be connected to a very authoritarian and sort of setup. So the more solidaristic you are, the more restrictive you are on the way people have to behave.
Yeah, that was my point, I think. And in your quote, Rouven, by Léon Bourgeois, liberty came last.
Yeah, it's true. It's a good point.
Okay, I think this is a good point to stop. It's 2 p.m. Thank you very much, Rouven. This was indeed very, very interesting and very stimulating. And I think we were able to make a lot of connections to a lot of other fields. I was also very pleased that we had a more sociological, historical session that complements very well what we had in the past sessions and what we will have in the next sessions, where we will also have topics coming from legal studies and other disciplines. Now we reconvene in 2 weeks' times with a different type of seminar, which will be a conversation for the future of Europe. And the speaker will be Kalypso Nikolaidis with a paper on a democratic panopticon for the recovery fund as a new form of permanent citizen involvement in EU decision making. And the format will be also a bit different, as we will have also 2 discussants, one of which is still to be confirmed. So hopefully I will see many of you again for another interesting session in 2 weeks' time. It doesn't look that it will be in presence, so we will continue to work online, but as we can see, it still works fine. Thank you very much, Rouven. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good rest of the week and have a good rest of the day as well. Bye-bye.